This is the Fusion Factor.
Hello, I'm Justin Oldham, author of Being Legally Blind, which was published in 2010. After the book came out, I got a lot of email asking me about what it was like to be a working person who didn't see very well, and I thought instead of talking about me, I would give you a chance to hear from somebody who is like me. So for the next 30 minutes, I'd like to share with you a conversation I had with SueEllen O'Connor. She is a social worker. She is the State Blind Services Coordinator for the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, and I'm going to let her tell you what all that's about. But she has a visual impairment similar to my own. She's got her own story to tell, and without any ado, let's get right into it, because we, all of us who have some kind of disability, we learn to live with it. This is our version of normal, and adulthood doesn't have to be all bad. There is life after school, and professional pursuits can be quite rewarding. Well, now, SueEllen, it's fair to say that you and I go a long way back, but for the sake of people who haven't heard your voice before, why don't you start by telling us who you are?
My name is SueEllen O'Connor, and as you know, we went to school, two separate schools, but in Fairbanks, Alaska. We met in high school, and I think that we were the only two individuals in the district who were legally blind that I know of.
That's true, and we were responsible for at least 4 jobs, and so there's at least 4 people out there today who owe us their careers.
That's right. You must be talking about the teachers of the visually impaired.
Absolutely. So now, for those who don't know, fill us in on your situation. What are the specifics of your disability?
I was born with congenital cataract, and they believe it has something to do with my mom having a virus while she was pregnant with me. And back in the mid-'60s, they did not routinely remove cataracts from infants. Nowadays, they would, and then that child would develop almost normal vision. So I ended up developing deprivational blindness. And finally, one day, my cataracts were removed, and I got some vision. But then, probably 10 years ago, I developed glaucoma. And I always had sort of a little bit of pressure problems, but it became more severe, and I had multiple surgeries and now corneal transplants. And so it's one of those things that once you start getting treatment, you start having more problems. So my acuity has gone down through my adult years so that I'm now what they call counting fingers at about 4 feet in both my eyes.
Well, I can certainly relate to that. I was born with a condition called aniridia, and the short version of that is that I have no irises, and I have perpetual permanent glaucoma, and I could remember the days when I would count fingers at 4 inches.
Mm-hmm.
And I had similar cataract surgeries to your own. I actually had it twice, because they, for whatever reason, they came back for round 2, and I was just mean enough to say, go in there and get them.
I think that you point out one of the real frustrations of glaucoma, and then one of the potential complications with cornea transplants is the fluctuations, that at times you can see quite a bit better, and then you have a decline, and it's really a roller coaster sometimes with the emotions. And then there's a lot of surgeries, a lot of drops, a lot of eye appointments, and not everybody with visual impairments go through that whole process of interfacing with the medical world. And some people just have an eye condition that will always be the same. It's predictable, and others have the up and down with other conditions such as diabetic retinopathy and people with optic neuritis from, say, multiple sclerosis. And it's a whole different emotional response, I think, because the grieving sort of never really ends. You start getting used to where you're at, and then you lose a little more, and then you have to adjust to that. It can be very frustrating.
It is, and for those who don't know what we're talking about when we say grieving, that's That is a technically correct word and a very precise diagnosis, because we're not just feeling bad for what we don't have, we're feeling bad for what we lost. And, as our grandmothers used to tell us, you can't actually miss something until it's gone.
That's right. And when you're born with a visual impairment, and you go like I did many, many years with kind of having it the same, you're just used to, that's what your normal is. But once you lose any of that, it's really almost the same as a normally sighted person losing vision to begin with, because that was their normal.
That's true. Now, speaking of what is normal, I would like to point out for our listeners that you and I were both fairly well mainstreamed. We went to the regular public schools. We got into the same kind of trouble as anybody else. And, contrary to certain rumors, we did actually graduate with a certain degree of accomplishment from high school.
That's right. That's right, and we were involved in debate as well, which is challenging for someone with a visual impairment. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, absolutely, especially when they say, "Well, here's your topic. Go to the library and research it." And that's now back in our day, the presence of CCTVs and large print books, these things were just being introduced into widespread circulation, and we got to be some of the early users of those technologies. But I think it'll be reassuring to some folks that those things are so commonplace today that, speaking for myself, I pretty much have to go out of my way to ignore them.
Right, and you wouldn't believe the difference just at our local university, University of Alaska in Anchorage. I remember when I was a student there, it was, I would be in the computer area lab, and I'd have my face plastered to a 15-inch screen. There was no technology at all, and now they have this amazing disability support services program there with every kind of assistive technology you can imagine. It's come a long ways.
That's very true. Now, after we finished high school, we pretty much went our own separate ways. We did go off to college, but you and I took distinctly different paths. I was bound and determined to just be an anonymous civil service drone somewhere, so I got myself a political science degree and a history degree, and went off to work for the federal government, and after a while, I and they agreed that it would be a mutually beneficial parting, so I went on my way to become an author, and now, 12 years after life in the trenches as a starving writer, I now find myself elevated to the lofty position of publisher, which actually sounds better than it is. But tell us all, what did you do after high school?
Well, I was one of those students who couldn't figure out what I wanted to be, and so I was a music major, and then I actually got a degree in electronics, which is not exactly the best choice for a visually impaired person. So I worked for the FAA for a little while, and then I went back and I realized what I really wanted to do was counseling, and the reason why I was derailed from that is that I saw a college counselor who I had said, I really am interested in counseling, and he said, you wouldn't do very well because you don't make good eye contact and you can't read people's faces. And that was something that I always look back at as don't tell people they can't do something because of what your understanding of the limitations that person has are. Not to say that you should just say, pie in the sky, you can be whatever, we couldn't be a brain surgeon, either of us. But finally I did find my way back to that, and I ended up getting my master's in clinical psych and coming to work for DVR. And I was torn over that because, DVR is Division of Voc Rehab, is the state agency that works with people with disabilities, and I thought I never wanted anyone to say you work with people with disabilities because you have a disability. I wanted to earn everything outright, and now I finally come full circle and realize that having a disability helps you to have an inside understanding of what other people who come to our agency experience, and so it's really an asset. And so I've been here for 14 years, and last couple of years I've been the blind services coordinator for the state, as well as continuing on as a DVR counselor in the Wasilla office.
So now you'd say then that your blindness is more of a credential than it is an impediment.
I would say, of course, it is an impediment in real life when you're trying to get around and just dealing with the day-to-day challenges of being blind. But yeah, as far as what I do, it's definitely an asset. And you have to be careful too, because working with people who have degrees of vision loss, which is the majority of people who are legally blind have some vision, there's a certain experience, and then people who are totally blind have another experience. So I can't presume that I really understand everyone's experience with vision loss.
Well, that's true, but because you have actually had different degrees of vision, it's probably second nature to you to at least cognitively realize that each new client that walks through your door is a different case.
Absolutely. I just think it's important for us to always remind ourselves, and then from disability to disability too, because so many people come in with multiple issues, such as depression is a very common thing that people with disabilities who haven't really mastered, where to put that disability in their when they look at themselves and it's part of their persona. People struggle with depression, especially when their disability impacts them financially and their career and maybe even their family and, of course, transportation. So depression and other mental health issues are important to not minimize with our population of disabilities.
All of that rings very true for me, because in my own professional history, in my own professional experience, what I find is that I regard myself as first and foremost me. Blindness is not who I am. It is one of many components of what I am, but it is not who I am. It's like wearing a coat. I wear it. It does not wear me. But when I deal with employers, that's not how it happens. And here's the breakdown in my 25 years of employment history. 48% of prospective employers will tell me, hey man, I'm not going to hire you because I don't think you can do this. 50% of employers will say, Justin, I want to spare you the pain and misery of failure and defeat, so I'm not going to hire you. And it's been my quest, like searching for the Holy Grail, to look for that enlightened 2%. And I can honestly say that when you look at my resume, each and every single one of those jobs represents an enlightened employer, and those interviews always went differently. And about 60% of the time, they would tell me, "I don't care," and that was the end of the conversation. And then followed 2 weeks later by a letter in the mail saying, "Hey, congratulations, you got the job."
And this is why it is so critical for us, those of us who work with people who are looking for work and have a disability, to spend a lot of time talking about how do you talk to someone about your disability. And people who are fortunate enough to have a hidden disability, we always recommend, if you don't have to inform your employer about your disability, it's best not to, because people will integrate that into their fears about how do you work with someone like that, are they a safety risk, and all the things an employer is thinking. But with blindness, there's no getting around that. So you have to think of really creative ways to present to the employer how, without focusing too much attention on it, because it is just a part of you, not all of you, how to present that and give it a positive spin, because there's a lot of societal fears and prejudices that people don't even know they have, very deep-seated opinions about the blind that people probably wouldn't even consciously confess to.
Well, I think the number one sin that they don't confess to is their overabundance of compassion and the idea that they're going to hold you back and somehow that's good for you. And I recall a lesson from my childhood. And I was out riding my bicycle, and my dad tells me, don't go down a certain road. Well, I went down a certain road, crashed, burned, and just skinned my knee from actually knee to ankle. You could see the bone, the whole thing. Afterwards, while he's sitting there dressing my wounds, he says, well, what are you going to do next time? And I said, well, I don't think I'll go down that road. And he says, all right, lesson learned. And so we do need some failure in our lives, and the people who think that they're doing us a favor by keeping us from it are actually not.
And I have met those people, those unfortunate individuals who either were coddled by their parents or their teachers passed them through. And it's really unfortunate because then they grow up and they expect that from society. But it's not that way. If you're just living on Social Security and barely scraping by, no one's going to say, oh, well, you don't have to deal with your mail or your bills or, it's okay because you're an adult now and you got to take care of yourself, So it's very unfortunate.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
Okay, now it's time for me to throw some rocks, because that's honestly one of the things that I do not like about government institutions that are trying to help the disabled, because even for outfits like your own, and DVR was very good to me, but I still got the standard issue dose of sit down, shut up, take your check, and everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that maybe that's where having the disability helps a counselor to really help an individual in a way that someone who doesn't have a disability would, and also a person who really believes that people with disabilities have the right to go to work in this country. And like the sign I always have in my office that has actually offended some people says that if I do for you what you can do for yourself, I give you two messages. One is that I care for you very much, and the other is that I think you're incompetent. And I really like that because that's how my parents were with me. They weren't going to do anything for me that I could do for myself, even if they knew I'd struggle doing it. And that's where you learn the valuable lesson of independence, as much independence as you possibly can have.
Well, that's very true. And going back to our days in Fairbanks, I can remember that you and I both had very similar experiences in that when we said we wanted to go do something, our parents took us there, they dropped us off, they left us there to do it, and then they came back to get us later. And I remember talking to you about that at the time, that you were remarking that there were sighted kids who just couldn't handle that level of responsibility because, it's so hard, I have to be back at the drop-off point in 3 hours, and how am I going to know? And we thought it was funny at the time, but here we are today as adults, and it's a skill that we don't even think about.
Yeah, I know. I think that being forced to find your own independence, and maybe it's something within us too. I just was always really stubbornly wanting to do things myself, and not everybody is so much that way, but I think that if parents foster that, they'll have a more successful, that child will grow up to be more successful as an adult and more independent, for sure.
Okay, now talk about that a little bit more. What did your parents do to foster your independence?
Well, my mother would tend to lean on the side of, oh, honey, she can't do that. She can't vacuum the floor because she doesn't see everything. And my dad would say, well, she can vacuum the whole damn thing then. So I think my dad really was the primary person that pushed me to be independent, and my mom just deferred because she ultimately knew it was best for me, but you know how moms run to take care of. And they really did not treat me any differently than my sister. And I would say the only thing that they would do is we did travel a lot, or move around a lot. So if we'd end up at a new school, my dad would arrange to take me in advance so I would know where my classroom would be so that I could learn the route at the school. But, to me, that's just reducing your fear by helping you come equipped to deal with your environment, And, when I got done with high school, my parents weren't, my dad's the son of an immigrant, and they weren't real savvy in the ways of modern society, and they'd never taken public transportation. So they were like, yeah, we hear there's a bus to the university. Have you got that figured out? And I'm like, yeah, I got to figure out. They just assumed I was going to figure out my own way.
Well, I got some of that, but I lived in an environment of a different structure. I grew up in a military house. My father was an officer, and there are three major things you can say about life inside the military. And that it is very much a meritocracy. It is results oriented, and it is very image driven. So that was it was a source of great heartburn for my father, because while on the one hand he wanted to help me, and he wanted to make sure that I succeeded, but on the other hand, he wanted very much to quietly, secretly, privately hope that I just wouldn't screw up so bad that I'd ruin his life, and that played a role in a lot of things.
That's a little bit of pressure.
It was, and there was very definitely a pressure to perform. Earlier I mentioned riding a bicycle, and that was one of the things that I was expected to do as a sign of normalcy. And so I learned to walk the neighborhood doing my advanced reconnaissance, figure out where everything was. And every time we would move to a new duty station, I would always start off the same way. Start riding the bike in a certain parking lot, and then I would expand my horizons one day at a time. So eventually I got to the point where I'd know the layout of the base well enough I could ride from one end to the other, and my dad was always proud of that, because he could say to his peers, see, he's not really in such bad shape, he can do that.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so in a way they sort of gave us the same treatment with different motivations.
That's very true. Now, how did your parents direct you to deal with bullies? Because I'm sure you got different advice than I did.
Oh, well, I definitely have memories of bullies, and, the one thing I remember most strongly was my dad saying, if people laugh at you, laugh with them. Act like you're just laughing right along with them, and it'll take away their pleasure. So that was one bit of advice. And then he always told me to stand up for myself and, not let people push me around, and, embrace my inner Irishness.
So in other words, your parents, or at least your father anyway, did green light you to fight back.
Oh yeah, and I did a couple times too. Yeah, he did.
I was quite notorious for it. I have here in my filing cabinet a collection of my report cards from first grade on through the end of high school, and I get a lot of "does not play well with others."
Oh, now the other thing, and that's unusual, especially when your parents might be concerned about your safety and not seeing what's going on, So that's kind of surprising. We both have that. But the other thing that I always find interesting talking with people who are visually impaired as children is what little tricks they used for coping. And, like I said before, I had gone to a lot of different schools, and I remember the first year that my sister and I were split up, because we always had a deal that we'd meet after school and we would go to the bus. And so when we were in Virginia, we were split, and I was in a middle school, and nowhere near where she went to school, and so I had to memorize the people that were on my bus, and then when I first got there in the morning, I'd look around for them and remember what they were wearing so I could try to identify them, and then I'd wait by the lockers and follow them to the bus, rather than, it was an elaborate scheme, rather than just asking an adult, can you show me to bus number, whatever,
Well, I used to do very much the same thing, and a lot of those old school buses, I quickly learned through the use of my exceptional hearing that a lot of those old school buses had their own individual ticks. So it wasn't hard for me to just memorize the sound that my particular bus would make, and I could just go right to it.
Oh, that's pretty clever.
And then I would do the same thing. There were certain people in school, because I knew who they were and I knew where they were going, I would just fall in the line behind them and let them take me to wherever I was going.
And Lord help us on the days they were sick.
That would be something of a challenge, but I learned long before I was ever taught orientation and mobility skills. I learned the basics of tactile referencing or landmarking, and you will see other visually impaired people do these things. They'll walk down a hallway and they've got just one finger that periodically touches the wall.
Yeah.
When they reach a certain intersection or a certain water fountain or a certain potted plant or something, as soon as they make physical contact with it, they just turn and move and go. And that's what that's what I did for the first 12 years of my life. For my first 12 years, the world was a gray fuzz, and all the stuff that I did, I might not have the courage to do as an adult today.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, before I had my first corneal transplant, my finger counting range was about 4 feet, and that was, for wishful thinking, was 4 inches, and that was the limit of my world view. Now today, I have 6 feet, and that's still the limit of my world view, but to do all of that as a child, ignorance is bliss, and I was a very happy boy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's probably something to a person's personality impacting how they adjust to blindness. Even if you have the most ideal parents and the best assistants through the school district, personality has to play a role in that. And for me, I think I was always a happy kid, and I just always had this sense that things were going to work out however they did. Even if I kind of got lost for a while, I figured I'd just turn around and take the route back exactly how I came, and it would work out. And it always seems to have, most of the time.
So now, speaking of making things work out, tell us a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of your job, and then throw in there somewhere a shameless plug about how people get a hold of you.